Here's a scenario that sounds like a conspiracy theory, except it's completely, provably true. Imagine your own government deciding that too many people are drinking, comes up with a solution, not to help them, not to treat them, but to secretly poison the alcohol supply, knowing full well that ordinary citizens will drink it and die. It happened, right here in the United States in the 1920s. During Prohibition, when Americans refused to stop drinking, the federal government deliberately made the nation's alcohol deadly, and by some estimates, it killed more than 10,000 of its own people. This is the almost unbelievable true story of the time the government put poison in your drink on purpose. To understand how we got here, we have to go back to the start of Prohibition. In 1920, the United States did something extraordinary. It banned alcohol entirely, making it, selling it, transporting it all illegal, written right into the Constitution. It was called the Noble Experiment, and the idea was that if you could just get rid of booze, you'd cure society of drunkenness, crime, and poverty in one stroke. It was wildly idealistic. And it failed almost immediately in the most predictable way possible. People did not stop drinking, not even close. They just started drinking in secret. In fact, Prohibition didn't kill drinking culture, it supercharged it, just underground. All across the country, secret bars called speakeasies popped up by the thousands, hidden behind unmarked doors in basements and behind fake storefronts. To get in, you needed to know the right password. And supplying all these illegal bars was a massive, booming black market run by bootleggers and organized crime. Gangsters like Al Capone got unbelievably rich smuggling and selling illegal liquor. There was a huge, insatiable demand for booze, and a whole criminal industry sprang up to meet it. There was just one problem for the bootleggers. Where do you get millions of gallons of alcohol when it's illegal to make the drinking kind? And their clever, fateful answer to that question is the key to this entire dark story. Here was the bootleggers' brilliant workaround. Alcohol wasn't totally gone from society, because alcohol has tons of industrial uses. It's in paints, solvents, cleaning fluids, fuels, and countless products. This industrial alcohol was still produced legally and in huge quantities. Chemically, it's basically the same stuff as drinking alcohol. So bootleggers realized they could simply steal or divert massive amounts of industrial alcohol and turn it into bootleg booze. But the government had already anticipated this. To stop people from drinking industrial alcohol, the law required it to be denatured, meaning manufacturers had to add nasty chemicals to it to make it foul-tasting, sickening, and undrinkable. The idea was you could use it to clean your paintbrush, but you'd never want to drink it. So the bootleggers hit this poisoned wall, and they came up with a solution of their own. The bootleggers' answer was to fight chemistry with chemistry. They hired their own chemists, skilled ones, and set them to work reversing the process. If the government added poisons to make industrial alcohol undrinkable, the bootleggers' chemists would try to remove those poisons and renature it, turning it back into something you could safely drink and sell. And for a while, this worked reasonably well. The chemists could filter and redistill the stolen industrial alcohol, strip out most of the added toxins, and produce passable bootleg liquor. It became a chemical arms race. The government would add poison, the bootleggers' chemists would take it out. The government was losing that race, watching millions of gallons of its poisoned industrial alcohol get cleaned up and poured into the nation's illegal drinks. And so, in the mid-1920s, the government decided to escalate, dramatically. This is the moment the story turns genuinely dark. Frustrated that bootleggers kept cleaning up its industrial alcohol, the federal government, around 1926, ordered the formulas changed. They demanded that industrial alcohol be made much more poisonous, harder to clean, and far more deadly. Most chillingly, they dramatically increased the amount of methanol, also known as wood alcohol, added to the mix. And here's why that's so sinister. Methanol is brutally toxic to humans. Even relatively small amounts can cause blindness, and larger amounts cause an agonizing death. The government knew with complete certainty that bootleggers' chemists would not be able to fully remove this stronger poison, and that the resulting liquor would blind and kill the Americans who drank it. They did it anyway. The logic was cold. It would be a deterrent. If people knew the booze might kill them, maybe they'd finally stop drinking. And the result was exactly what you'd expect. People started dying. Because here's the thing the government's cold logic ignored. The people drinking this stuff had no idea. They weren't warned. A working man buying a drink at his local speakeasy had no way of knowing whether that particular batch had been properly cleaned by a skilled chemist, or whether it was full of government-boosted wood alcohol that would leave him blind or dead by morning. Every single drink became a game of Russian roulette. Across the country, hospitals began filling with people who were going blind, suffering, and dying from poisoned liquor. It didn't stop the drinking. The addiction and the demand were far too strong for that. It just meant that the people who kept drinking, as they always would, were now being quietly killed by their own government. The horror of the program crystallized during the holidays of 1926 in New York City. Over that Christmas, the city's hospitals were suddenly swamped with a wave of people who had been poisoned by tainted holiday liquor. In the span of just a couple of days around the holiday, dozens of people were sickened and a number of them died, gasping and blind, in hospital beds, while the rest of the city was celebrating. It was a grim, concentrated snapshot of what the poisoning program was doing all year round, all over the country. Christmas, a time of celebration, turned into a mass poisoning event, courtesy of a federal policy. And it was this shocking holiday death toll that finally pushed one brave man to blow the whistle on the whole thing. That man was Charles Norris, the chief medical examiner of New York City, and he was a genuine pioneer, one of the founding figures of modern forensic science. Norris and his brilliant toxicologist, Alexander Gettler, studied the poisoning deaths in detail, and Norris was absolutely appalled by what he found. He understood exactly what was happening. The federal government was knowingly and deliberately poisoning its own citizens to death. And unlike many officials, he refused to stay quiet about it. Norris publicly and furiously denounced the program. He issued reports, he spoke to the press, and he flatly accused the government of what amounted to official murder, deliberately killing people who, whatever their vices, did not deserve a death sentence for taking a drink. He became the loudest, most credible voice screaming that the government's own policy was a homicidal disgrace. You might think that being publicly accused of poisoning your own people would make a government immediately stop. It did not. Astonishingly, the program had its defenders, and they mounted a genuinely chilling argument. Some supporters of Prohibition, the Dries, as they were called, essentially argued that the deaths were the drinkers' own fault. Their reasoning went like this: alcohol was illegal, everyone knew it was illegal, and anyone choosing to drink bootleg liquor was a criminal knowingly taking a risk. If they died, well, they'd assumed the risk themselves by breaking the law. The poison, in this view, wasn't murder. It was just an extra consequence of a choice people shouldn't have been making anyway. It's a coldly logical, deeply disturbing argument that the government bears no responsibility for the deaths because the victims chose to drink, and it was enough to keep the poisoning program running. And so, unbelievably, the poisoning continued for years. Even as the death toll mounted, even as respected figures like Norris kept sounding the alarm, the federal government kept its industrial alcohol lethally poisoned right through the rest of the decade. People kept drinking, because that's what addiction and human nature do, and people kept dying. By the time it was all over, the estimates for how many Americans were killed by their own government's poisoning program range into the many thousands, a figure often cited as high as 10,000 deaths or more over the life of the program. Think about that number. 10,000 people, potentially, killed not by gangsters, not by accident, but as the direct, intended result of their own government's policy. It stands as one of the most shocking things any government has ever knowingly done to its own citizens in peacetime. So how did it finally stop? Not through some grand moral awakening about the poisoning itself, but because the entire disastrous experiment of Prohibition collapsed. By the early 1930s, it was undeniable to almost everyone that Prohibition had been a catastrophic failure. It hadn't stopped drinking. It had just created a monstrous black market, enriched violent gangsters, corrupted the police and courts, and as we've seen, gotten thousands of people poisoned. The public had had enough. In 1933, The United States did something it had never done before or since. It repealed a constitutional amendment, ending prohibition and making alcohol legal again. And with legal, regulated, safe alcohol back on the shelves, the need for bootleg industrial alcohol vanished. And with it, the government's monstrous poisoning program finally, quietly came to an end. So why should we remember this bizarre, dark chapter today? Because it's a genuinely important cautionary tale about how good intentions, taken to an extreme, can curdle into something monstrous. The people behind Prohibition and the poisoning program largely believed they were doing the right thing, saving society from the evils of alcohol. But that certainty led them, step by step, to a place where they were knowingly killing their own citizens and defending it as justified. It's a stark reminder of a dangerous pattern. When a government becomes convinced that its cause is so righteous that any means are acceptable, ordinary people end up paying with their lives. The road to that Christmas poisoning in 1926 was paved, at every step, with people who thought they were the good guys. That's the part worth remembering. So there it is. The time the United States government looked at a population that wouldn't stop drinking and decided the solution was to poison the alcohol and let them die. Over 10,000 people, by some estimates, killed by a deliberate policy of their own leaders, a fact so dark it sounds made up, and yet it's thoroughly documented history. It took a courageous forensic scientist screaming into the void and the total collapse of Prohibition itself to finally end it. The next time someone tells you a government would never knowingly harm its own citizens, you can tell them about the Christmas of 1926, when the poison in the eggnog came straight from the top. If you love history that's true, dark, and told to you straight, subscribe. We've got a whole world of it. See you in the next one.